Well, thank you so much again for joining us today. Well, we're getting ready to get kicking off today. Please go ahead and put in the chat box where you are joining us from today so that we can get to know one another. For those of you joining us for the first time, we are delighted to be welcoming you. The Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center is a nonprofit committed to helping entrepreneurs achieve their biggest, boldest vision in the world. We help founders make connections and get resources and access in the ways that they need it. As a center, we're here to help you in your journey, wherever that may take you, and through all of the difficulties that you may face. We also want to recognize our sponsors who make all of this possible. As a nonprofit, we charge for nothing and take no equity. So it is thanks to their generous contributions that we're able to provide these amazing series, this education, and this support. So to our sponsors, thank you so much for believing in the power of innovation and the power of entrepreneurship worldwide. We're delighted to also be sharing with our group today that we are launching a new series of learn-in webinars, as well as our mentoring and coaching circles led by industry experts from across our Nasdaq Center community. Now, these new programs are here to help you solve the most pressing issues that you're facing, while immediately helping you change through circumstances and adversity that you may be battling. And again, thank you for joining us for Leading Through Crisis, a town hall event with our amazing special guests today, John Chambers and Jeff Thomas. We're going to get started here in just a moment. But before we do, we have a couple of polls that we would like to launch to help us understand how to better serve you in these difficult times. The first poll that we're launching right now is one that we've been measuring pretty much for the last 6 weeks. And this is in an effort to understand the sentiment of the survivability of our entrepreneurs. We're trying to understand how you are feeling in this time. And we have again been tracking this for the last 6 weeks. And we'll be sharing this periodically with our community at large to help you feel how you're doing against everyone else. And the second poll that we're going to be launching is basically with an idea to understand what type of entrepreneur you actually are. We have one that's asking whether or not you're a current entrepreneur, one that is whether or not you're an aspiring entrepreneur, and the other is whether or not you're a supporter of entrepreneurs. So we are going to go ahead and ask you to fill out that poll right now. Now, while we're doing that, please note that we are going to be taking questions throughout today's town hall. If you can go ahead and put that answer or list those questions into the Q&A box that we'll be having available throughout the town hall. And that will allow us to make sure that John and Jeff has a chance to look at these questions and respond to them as we go. Our third poll that we're going to be launching is to help understand what's keeping you up at night right now. The questions that we'd like you to answer is whether or not it's finance, sales, marketing, scaling, pivoting, your team, or honestly just surviving. So if you can go ahead and share your information, and I think we may be having a little bit of technical problems on that poll. Here we go, just when you need it. There we go, it's launching up right now. So if you can go ahead and share what's keeping you up at night right now, this allows us to actually draw intel and put forward programs that are responsive based on what you're currently needing the most right now. So you'll see us actually use these to reflect and build out programs of support over the coming weeks. Let me go ahead and just share, interestingly enough right now, we're seeing a slight skew towards sales, which is great. So sales and finances being our top two responses. All right, well, without further ado, again, we are delighted to be hosting today's session, Leading Through Crisis, a town hall event with our amazing special guests, John Chambers and Jeff Thomas. John is the executive chairman of Cisco and CEO, founder of JC2 Ventures, and a remarkable author as well. And Jeff Thomas is joining us as SVP, head of Western US listings and capital markets at Nasdaq. And again, John and Jeff, we're delighted to be hosting you here today and look forward to an engaging conversation.
Thanks, Nicola, and welcome to everybody back to the center for our first ever virtual town hall. Now, John, for this conversation, I'd like to set the stage a little bit. You're a full-time investor at JC2 Ventures, You're a committed mentor and an accomplished author. And you've had a prolific career as the CEO of Cisco, where you grew the company from 400 people to over 75,000 employees. And you increased revenues from 70 million to over $47 billion. You made 180 acquisitions, creating the blueprint that many use today for efficient acquisitions that drive both innovation and financial returns. And importantly, you've led through 5 financial crises, 5 healthcare crises, 3 supply chain crises, and now here we are with the global pandemic that is COVID-19. So I guess to kick off, while we've never been in this specific situation, you've clearly led through a number of challenging situations. So what's your strategy or playbook, as you like to call it, for dealing with a crisis as a leader?
Well, Jeff, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with Nasdaq. We've been friends for 30 years with your organization, and a win-win relationship between Cisco and now my startups with the Nasdaq. On the overall playbook, I think it starts with what is the role of the CEO or the founders during a periods of crisis. The first role of a CEO and founder is strategy and vision for the company. The second is develop, retain, recruit, and periodically change the management team, the leadership team to implement that strategy and vision. Third is communications, and fourth is culture. And in a period of crisis, communications and culture actually is as important or more important than even strategy and vision and the leadership team. In terms of the crisis, the basic playbook, and unfortunately I've had a lot of practice. I know for many people on the video today, this is your first crisis. I mean, it's been 12 years since we had a serious problem. We used to have economic problems every 3 to 5 years. So unfortunately, my generation was used to seeing these, still didn't do great jobs on them, but we're used to the crisis of 2008 with the Great Recession, the 2001 dot-com bubble. And the way that you approach it is very similar each time. You want to be very realistic how much of it is self-inflicted and how much it would do to market criteria. If you have issues such as product quality, inability to share your company, and you have a market phenomenon like we're hitting today, you've got to address both at the same time. Then basically what you do is say, what are, I like odd numbers, the 5 to 7 platforms or programs you're going to run to deal with the challenges in front of you. And that usually is around cash, it really usually is around expenses, around how you're going to focus on your customers, your employees, your partners. And I like 1 or 2 areas where you're dreaming what's possible, new areas that you're going to go into with a very limited amount of resource. Third, you basically assume these always last longer than you think and will be deeper. So you do your scenario A, B, and C planning, usually end up with a budget off the A, but then know that B could be your expense challenges. And so if you have to make cuts, make them deep one time. Try not to ever have a second shoe drop. So make the transitions quickly. And then where I saw from your participants group there on the questions, many of them are now moving from survival. And if you didn't think it was survival 2 or 3 months ago, you weren't being realistic. But today, many people have made their early decisions. Now they're positioned for how they go forward, what roles do sales have, where are your customers in the decision criteria, et cetera. Then you set specific goals, given the time frame that you're after, and you report regularly to your employee community, to your shareholders, to your customers, to the market, what you're doing. So there's that trust and transparency on it. And then you paint the picture of your North Star. Here's what we look like when we come out of this, and here's what the opportunities are in front of us. We did that every time at Cisco. We didn't do things perfectly. I got surprised a couple of times, and a couple of times we saw them coming, but we came out of every downturn with much stronger position in the industry. And candidly, each time pulled away from our competitors, many of which got left behind during the downturn. So let me stop there and take it where you'd like to go from here, Jeff.
Well, I think that's a great lead into, as you kind of look back over your time at Cisco, when you led through these downturns, what were some of the big successes that you were able to lead through? And then what were some of the decisions that you would likely do over and do differently?
Well, anytime you're in uncharted waters, you like to talk about the successes. But it's really probably the mistakes that this audience can learn from as much as what we did well. In fact, I think as a leader, you're more a product of how you handled your setbacks and your successes. But let's start with the successes because they are more fun to talk about. 1997, 1998, there was an Asian financial crisis. Many of the tiger economies in Asia got into trouble. Many high-tech companies, including Cisco, had invested big time in Asia. And when the crisis hit, many of those companies turned around and withdrew their resources out of Asia. I was a product of IBM and Wang Laboratories. I knew that my Asian counterparts would remember forever how I treated them during the tough time. So at a time that everybody else withdrew, I doubled down in Asia. And long story short, 18 months later, we were number one in every major Asian country, and we never lost track of that. A setback, 2001, classic dot-com bubble. During 2001, literally 50% of the venture-backed high-tech startups disappeared. And many of my large counterparts, many of whom were customers, doing $1 billion a year with us in terms of purchasing from Cisco, disappeared as well. I did not see it coming. We had gone on 10 years, 40 quarters, if you will, of uninterrupted growth. We had created 10,000 millionaires among our employees, actually a number higher than that. We had won every award there was to win. We were the most valuable company in the world at one point in time. And our lowest growth had been never below 50%. So in the first week in December in 2000, our business was up 70%. We tended to always look at the connecting, if you will, the trends that you see, so we could say versus the first week in December versus a year before, the month, the quarter, we could project what the next year would be remarkably accurate, plus or minus 1 or 2%. My numbers look good. I told the market I thought we were in good shape. 45 days later, we were growing at minus 30%. Minus 30, you think it's impossible. It was 100% swing on the numbers. And so we needed to make the changes. I traveled around the world for about 2 weeks, met with key customers, key partners, talked to some of the senior execs who had been through this crisis before in prior generations, and decided at the end of the 2 weeks we had to change. I announced that to my leadership team in the morning. We announced it to the market that afternoon. We did all the changes in 51 days. On day 52, we started gaining market share before almost any of our competitors really started to deal with the issue. So even though it was the most painful thing I've ever done in my life, it was my family. I'd recruited every employee of the 40,000 people at Cisco, with the exception of 20 of them. And I knew every illness that was life-threatening for them, their spouse, or their kids. And we had a great culture. Our attrition rate ran 5% in an industry that was running 15%. And so for me to make that tough decision about laying off people, to reset expenses and reset expectations, especially after you just become the most valuable company in the world and people suddenly question about your leadership style, it was very humbling, would be an understatement. And if there aren't self-doubts, you're not being honest about yourself. However, I felt this was the right plan of action. We went after it very aggressively, and the results were we broke away from all of our key competitors in that terribly tough process.
Well, and you mentioned the impact on the venture-backed ecosystem. You're now a VC yourself. You've got a great portfolio at JC2 Ventures. How are you spending your time as an investor? How are you counseling your existing companies? How are you thinking about new investments?
Well, my parents were both doctors, and they taught me very early age to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you wish it was. It doesn't mean you don't learn from looking backwards, but you deal with the challenges, the illness, if you will, the way it exists today, and then you paint the picture for how you move forward. So the first thing is I'm realistic on what the challenges will be for startups. We could have a very active discussion on what percentage of VC-backed startups will fail or not this economic challenge. If you look at the past, 2001, as I said earlier, 50% of the VC-backed startups failed. 2008, it was 30%. My view on this one, unfortunately, I think it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be more in the 35 to 40% will not make it through this. So what you do with the companies you're trying to help coach through the approach is you walk them through their game plan for dealing with the current issues. You help them talk about how do they transition to where the market's going. You help them paint the picture for the future, and you give them nudges that makes us all uncomfortable about deal with this one time if you can. Then you've got to make the transition that many of the viewers of this podcast are looking at, which is how do you get ready to scale and grow when you come out, but with a sliding scale. It may be as long as, candidly, 3 to 5 quarters before you start to see dramatic growth again, depending on the company that you're in. For some companies, if you're in a spot that saves a lot of money or cybersecurity, it's very likely you're seeing good growth even today in terms of positioning. So you slide that scale forwards or backwards, but you do get ready for growth, and you continue to be conservative, in my opinion, on your expenses. You want to be realistic. I think when I talk to other VC companies, most of them are trying to get their portfolio companies to have at least 24 months of cash at their disposal based on their current run rates. And you've got to be able to weather the storm if it gets tougher before it gets better. My own view is that I think the next couple of months are looking reasonable. I'm starting to see startups suddenly have a lot of increase in activity from their customers or their business to business. What occurs in the fall, no one knows. I do think the economies the next 2 quarters will be disastrous in terms of GDP issues and perhaps an unemployment rate, which I never thought I'd ever see in my lifetime, of over 20% in the US is very much a number that may occur. And then it's how do we get ready for going forward? And that's where I spend the majority of the time with the startups, talking about their customer relations, talking about how they're going to scale, talking about what they have to do different on services, being realistic. Are their products a must-have during the times of the crisis? Or are they ones that are very important, but probably 12 to 24 months out, in which case they'll get put on the back burner for a little while in terms of before they have a chance to come back to their prior run rate. But I think with the right execution and product differentiation, most of the companies that listen to this have a good chance not just of surviving, but as the inevitable upturns occur, using this as a chance to break away.
And so when you look at your portfolio and just the industry in general, what sectors do you see as growing, and then which ones are not? And so in the case of a founder who's in a growing industry, the few that are out there, how do you capitalize on that? And if you're in one of those industries that's taking a lot of headwinds now, how do you batten down the hatches and steady the ship?
Okay, so in the sequence you raised them, first is business to business is a safer place to be right now than business to consumer. I think we all understand that. The consumer will probably take at least 1, if not 2 to 3 quarters longer to come back to the prior rates before the business, after the business does already. In terms of as you think out, for the future, the areas that are hottest for me in technology are artificial intelligence as it relates to cost savings. So anything that you can outline in terms of large companies or small to medium companies that will dramatically increase their productivity, their automation, if you will, using new technologies like artificial intelligence to leverage that type of innovation are extremely hot. The call center experience is an example. Now I have 2 companies, Unifor and ASAP, that are at this area very directly on it. Both of them are growing between 100 and 300%, even in today's times. Cybersecurity, as I alluded to earlier, the activity is up almost 5-fold in terms of the number of cyber attacks companies are facing. So if you have the right products in cybersecurity, that's going to be a very good growth area. And I don't think the market's going to move away from the Internet of Things, of complete digitization of every company, but they're going to go at a slower pace. So you want to figure out where your products are in terms of the outcomes your customers want. And is this something that they're going to continue at a pace that we saw before? Or is it something that's going to have a couple tough quarters and then come back? Key industries, I think all of us understand the hottest ones starting to suddenly occur, which were not hot before: education, distance learning, healthcare. And you're seeing a lot of VC money start to go into those. The most secure industries, the banking industry, different than 2008, is really in good shape. So finance industry feels pretty good, insurance, et cetera. Obviously, the retail and transportation industries a little bit tougher. But even within those tough industries, there are going to be companies that are going to say, even though I'm struggling for survival, and these could be Fortune 100 companies, they're going to say, I'm going to position myself for what I want to look like when I come out of this to leapfrog some of my peers. Now, that's going to be a subset, probably less than a fourth of the company's niche troubled industry, but you are going to see certain airlines, certain manufacturing actually use this as a chance to try to break away. So if you're selling in those companies, you want to identify which ones they are, where you can help them in terms of positioning, et cetera, on it. And then you run the playbook with increasing speed. Jeff, I would not, even if I were in a growth area, I would not be adding headcount until I saw the next quarter how it plays out. So even my companies that are growing at 200 to 300%, we're in essence holding headcount, pausing, if you will, and we look at growth. And for segments that are getting hit harder and we're having a scenario B or scenario C, a tougher plan out, I'd be very careful about replacing even headcount until you get your operations really stabilized in a way that's sustainable.
That's great. Now, as we kind of talk about the future, we of course would love all companies to go public on Nasdaq someday, but
Yes.
The vast majority of startups exit through acquisition. And so, especially in a downturn, what's the right way for founders and CEOs to be thinking about building out an acquisition strategy so that you're not stuck in a fire sale?
Okay, so let's start with maybe even the question which allows you to get to an exit. As a leader or a founding group of a company, your currency is three elements: your track record, your relationship, and trust. And if you really think about it, that is why I bought 180 companies. I always bought them off their track record, the relationships they have with their customers, which I could check out very easy, and the relationship I was able to build with their CEOs or not, and the evaluation. And did I trust them? Were they culture like ours? And if I didn't trust, I didn't move. Secondly, what's the best way to get acquired? To prepare to go public. If you build a company to last, that's what I want to acquire as an acquirer. So I think your strategy is very similar in terms of how you scale your organization, build it for the future, not build it as an exit package. If I'm seeing somebody build a company that they want to be acquired and then they're going to leave and move on, I probably don't want to acquire them. But the third element, I think most important, is it's about results. And for me, it's about culture. So it's getting the business results, developing this relationship with your customers, building an organization that will smoothly either become part of the company that they get acquires you, or from the IPO. And candidly, going public on the Nasdaq, as you know, I'm a huge fan. It's because of 30 years of results from the Nasdaq, 30 years of building trusting relationships with multiple generations of your leaders. And it's about the trust I have in you. And so that's one of the things I would encourage each of the companies watching today's broadcast should think about as well.
Fantastic. Well, and you mentioned a key aspect to any acquisition is culture. And a big part of culture is diversity. Now, you've always been committed to diversity, and you've talked about it not as a nice to have, but a need to have. How does diversity, even in the middle of a pandemic, continue to be top of mind for you?
Gotcha. So in the sequence that you raised them, I was probably the exception, Jeff. Most people would acquire a company purely based on their products and their financial planning. My view in high tech, when you acquire a company, you're paying a premium versus what the company would be in the market, either public or private market. And by definition, therefore, what you're really acquiring is their next generation product and your ability to blow their products through your distribution chain. And if you believe that your attrition rate is going to be at the high 20s, if you acquire a company and you're not going to be able to keep the people, you don't get the next product generation out and you make a bad financial decision. Culture was a key part of whether we were able to acquire a company and keep the majority of the people. During the 20 years I was CEO at Cisco, our attrition rate of the acquired companies ran 4%, and in industry it runs in the 20s. And so part of the way we did it is we never acquired a company, no matter how good the financial picture was, unless the cultures were reasonably close and that fit into the Cisco culture. We're not perfect, but we acquired people who like us, who just try to do the right thing, who make innovation happen, put the customer first on whatever they do. And we're a family. I realize that's not for all. We're not a Netflix, which is an amazing company, but they're a professional team. It's up or it's out in terms of the approach. And so determine what your culture was and how do you drive it through in terms of the direction. So that's kind of how we would navigate through that. If during the evaluation process, I got surprised, good or bad, I would walk, because I made it at the front end, understanding no surprises, good or bad, is key. And I expect challenges anytime you do an acquisition. If there weren't challenges there, it's almost unheard of. If I know what they are, I can fix them in terms of the direction. So it is that replicatable playbook, if you will, for how you drive culture and direction. Now, Jeff, the second part of your question was?
So in times of a pandemic, how does that continue to be top of mind for you, given the current challenges companies are facing?
Well, I think in terms of the pandemic, then's what you get to see what people really like under pressure. And even when I'm doing an acquisition or looking at as a venture capitalist, I'm really a strategic partner with my companies, a mentor, a coach. I look at how they handle stress, and I often put stress on them. So you get to see what people are like under stress. And it's hard for them to really hide it in terms of direction. It is so easy when it comes to tough times to suddenly put corporate social responsibility on the back burner. I think that would be a tremendous mistake, because the future of capitalism, if we stay with the old world definition, the companies are going to be in a lot of trouble. It's about benefit to your shareholders and to the market, but also the effect on society. And I think this time, more and more people will realize that. And well-run companies do both together. But during periods of toughness, it's so easy to put your values on the back burner, which I think is a major mistake. Your values by having a diverse workforce. Well, once it gets tough, maybe that isn't as important. It's more important than ever. A diverse workforce will always out-execute a workforce that looks too much identical in terms of the direction. Same thing with the values of your company. We were the most successful and one of the most profitable companies ever. Yet we won every corporate social responsibility award in the world, from Democrats and Republicans in the US, from Russia, from China, to the Middle East. And that culture and the culture of doing the right thing, even under times of tough stress, is probably what differentiated us as much as anything else.
Fantastic. Well, one last question here before we move to the audience Q&A.
Sure.
So you're from West Virginia, and as you talk about giving back, you've been deeply involved in supporting your home state's economic and technological advancement. Can you talk about why giving back is critical to your ethos as a leader, and how that philosophy has helped you lead during some great challenges?
So in the sequence you raised them, I'm honored to do that both in my home state, but also on a global basis. For it, because I believe when you build trust with relationships, and there are very few global leaders I haven't met with and have the trust of, you build it during the tough times when they need help or when there's a mutual challenge. I am the French high-tech ambassador for President Macron. Can you imagine America having a German or a Frenchman in charge of our high-tech ambassador from the US to the world? And they've moved their number of startups from 120 a year venture capital back to over 700, outlined a clear vision and a direction of where they needed to go. The same thing is true of Modi in India, with 1.3 billion people, the first real large digital country move ever made. And that enabled him to deal with a lot of the challenges, and still, unfortunately, early stages on the challenges there in India, but he's positioned the country, I think, very well for the future. What the US has not done well is our startups, which will be where all employment will be. All net job growth will come out of startups, small companies getting bigger. Large companies will cut headcount over the next decade. 40% of them will actually go out of business, et cetera. So your startup community is where the jobs will be. If we don't do that uniformly across all 50 states, we're not going to be able to have the economic growth that will absorb 25 million new jobs over this next decade, and the 10 to 15 million we would destroy because of digitization, AI, et cetera, on it. So taking a model out of the playbook that we ran in France and in India, doing it in partnership with West Virginia University, with the ability to do that with the governor, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate of the state, the Democrats and the Republicans, both at a state level and a national level, change the curriculum and outline a startup state with the ability to dream again and go forward. I think it's pretty exciting. And they've got a couple big projects going on, and I mean gigantic projects around the Virgin Hyperloop implementation for our nation, and around on the COVID issue, the ability to perhaps be capturing sensor capability that will give you an indication 2 to 3 days before you have any symptoms, you have a potential illness coming on. So it's the ability to dream what's possible, to have a state I'm very proud of with great people, that all we want is a chance to really make a difference. And for those of you in startups, you're the engine of the future. No pressure, but a large part of that across the whole part of the US, I think will determine our future as a nation.
Fantastic, John. Well, thanks for all your work on those important initiatives. We'll now move into audience Q&A section. So if you do have a question, please put them into the Q&A section function at the bottom of your screen. We may not have time to get to everybody's question, but we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. So John, the first one is, what are your thoughts on shifts or changes to business models? For example, will freemium models be a thing of the past as we move forward?
A bunch of questions in that. One thing we didn't touch on, Jeff, which I probably should have brought up earlier, what I look for when I invest in a company. I look for a market that is in transition driven by new technology. 30 years ago, that would have been Cisco with the internet, or 20 years ago with Amazon with the e-commerce type of move. Today, I look for a market transition going on with a new technology. We alluded to customer service, the ability to use artificial intelligence to help the agents be much more effective with a company's customers, and to be able to do so on remotely capability is an example. The second thing I look for is a CEO and his or her founding team. Are they wicked smart? Do they really get it? Then I go straight to customers. What does the customer see about them and the direction that they're going? Then I look, do they want to be coached as a leader, and do they have a chance to be one or two within their industry? So market transitions are what you compete against, not against competitors. If you're competing against a competitor, you're looking out your rear vision mirror. It's what's already occurred. You compete on market transitions, you just use competitors as a way of keeping score. The way that Cisco broke away from some of our early, very good startups, equally as good at products, is we got the market transitions right. The movement of the internet to outcome-based, changing the way you work, live, learn, and play. The reason we broke away from a Nortel, a Lucent, and Alcatel, tremendous engineers, really good people, many times our size, is they didn't get the transition from traditional analog capability, i.e. voice, et cetera, to everything going over the internet. And so when we competed on market transitions, that's when we completely broke away from them as well. So transitions are what I would encourage each of you today to focus on in the market, enabled by ideally a new technology, whether it's digitization, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, issues of that type.
Fantastic. Well, and a lot of questions here coming in around culture.
Yes.
But one of the more pressing questions is, how do you maintain culture when you're forced to do a layoff? And what is it that you can do to help, manage through that?
Oddly enough, that's a question I've dealt with twice today. And the important things on culture is you as a leader have to be the owner of that. It's you and your founding team that has responsibility for what the culture is. You should write it down, what the culture is and your values. And every decision you make, including the layoff, should match that culture. You've got to make innovation happen in my cultures. You put the customer first. You treat everybody with respect and as a family. You just do the right thing. If it's about survival of the company, you have to make changes and you have to do a layoff. I never thought I'd ever have to do one again. After 10 years at Cisco, I did. I made the tough decision. How you treat the people who leave is even more important than how you treat the people who stay, because the people who stay will watch how did you treat the people who leave. Third, you've got to share with your team why you made the changes, and you've got to show them why they were necessary, and then paint the picture for where you go. And it's natural, and by the way, this is part of human nature, when all of a sudden a leader, she or he does layoffs, all of a sudden the employees say, well, maybe this leader is not as good as I thought they were. For me in 2001, going from winning every CEO award imaginable to people saying, should I even have my job? And that's part, we're never as good as people think we are when it goes well. And when you hit your bumps, you've got to also realize that is part of leadership. And it's how you handle those bumps determine who you are. So what you do is you deal with it transparently. You try to make your changes once, not to have a second and a third shoe. You don't do anybody a favor by only taking 3% of your organization out and then coming back again and having to take 5 and come back again and have to take 5 more. If you could have done it one time at 7 or 8 and got your company structured the right way, that's what you should do as a leader. And the leadership is not a popularity contest. It's a contest of doing what's right based on your culture and driving it through. And then it's based on what your culture is, being transparent to everybody involved in it. Sounds basic, but that is the way you come through it. And your employees over time will respect you and value you as a leader for how you handle the tough times. Does that mean that they won't have doubts about you when you make the changes? Of course they will. That's just part of the process.
Thanks for that, John. Now, one of the other hot topics these days is, of course, the U.S.'s relationship with China. So you mentioned you've done business in China and managed through a number of different situations over there. How should startups today be thinking about U.S. trade and technology relationships, and then how it impacts everything from supply chain to sales? What's the right way to approach China these days?
So in the sequence you raised it, I understand I came out of IBM and Wang Laboratories, and Wang was, for all practical purpose, an American company with Chinese founders. Dr. Wang taught me a tremendous amount. China, I bet on China at a time that no one else would in 1995. And that was right as I became CEO, and a lot of people second guessed it. But there was a win-win mentality, tough negotiators, but a win-win for how China and the US, but also Chinese business and US businesses could work together so both sides won. Unfortunately, in recent years, it's become a win-lose mentality. And so it's a something I think has to get fixed. There has to be a much more level playing field. American companies have to know that their intellectual property is and will be protected. It is not today. And it's a win-lose type mentality. So in today's world, I probably would double down on India. It's where China was 20 years ago, a democracy, a true win-win mentality. I think China will eventually come back around, but I think things will probably get bumpier before it gets better in terms of the direction overall. I'm a huge believer, however, in global impact and how we work together. It's why I am the partner with US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. It's why I try to see startup states or startup nations all the way around the world. And I think technology can do that in a way that others cannot. But I think the relationship between startups and China is going to get tougher before it gets better.
So as an aspiring entrepreneur, you're looking at the current state of play and the world is in crisis. If you were planning to launch your company next quarter, would you push forward or would you wait a little bit?
I would go forward. Now, this is where the ability, pardon my Southern accent, but cash is important. If I had the cash available to power through the next 2 years, there's not a better time to start than during a crisis. All great companies went through a crisis and grew out of them. That's where Cisco came from, a Google, a Facebook, an Amazon, and the list is full of them in terms of the approach. And during periods of crisis, your competitors are not getting funded and people will not take the business risk they would during the good times. And so actually, as long as you can power through it from a financial point of view, I would absolutely go now. And I'd go now with maybe a third the cash and a third the aspirations. And then as you got further along, put those in place. What you cannot afford to do, however, is to begin to make investments now from scratch and not have a runway of at least 18 months, in my opinion, cash on hand to be able to navigate through the tough times, because customers will look at a startup and say, are they financially viable? Do I think they will survive this crisis? And I think that's something for each of us to understand. But long story short, I'd go now.
Great advice. Now, as a CEO, you mentioned you had some hits, you had some misses. What was a mistake that you made as CEO that profoundly impacted your philosophy as a leader, helped you to become a better leader or technologist, or even that you're leveraging now in your life as a VC?
Well, there's so many of them. I made early mistakes. I'm dyslexic. And I originally considered it a tremendous weakness that I wouldn't talk about it. But to being dyslexic forced you to think differently and forced you not to read things in sequence because you lose your spot, but picture the whole thing and how it evolves. And then I learned by sharing that I had this weakness with my employees, they actually valued my candor more than the weakness. And so it actually got me closer to people by showing my weaknesses, not my ability to lead, but my weaknesses and how you dealt with them. And once you learn how you work through the tough times, you know how to do it again and again. That's a little bit of the challenge now because most leaders have not seen this in 12 years. But once you get through this, you know how to do it the next time. You know how to execute within it overall. And so I think if there's one premise that you keep in place as you go through these crises, put your customer first, your employees second, and your culture third. And remember, your currency in the result is purely about track record, relationships, and trust.
Great. Now, one question here. You mentioned some of the great work you did with France, some of the great stuff that Modi's doing over in India, and some of the work you're doing at the state level. Given the pandemic, how does that change your view, if at all, on how government should or should not be investing in innovation?
Speaking very transparently, there's always a temptation during the periods of crisis to put innovation on the back burner and to just saying, I just want to go back the way it used to, and thinking that the solution that got you into trouble is going to be the one that gets you out of this crisis. That is not the case. It's inevitable that every government, every company will become a digital technology company, regardless if you're in healthcare, manufacturing, retail, it doesn't matter. And so it is important that as you go through this crisis, you paint the picture of what you want to look like as you come out of it. And so I think there will be a number of governments who will actually put innovation and new technology and even attracting the best and brightest to the country, which are your future job creators, on a back burner, which I think is a tremendous mistake. If done right, I think the opportunities for startup economy and a global startup economy actually get stronger, and people should see that now more than ever. But I think there'll be a large number of both companies and countries that misexecute here, that will try to think nostalgically about the way the world used to be as opposed to what it's going to be in the future, and deal with the world the way it is, not the way you wish it was, and then saying, how do you make things happen? So breakage on companies pretty high, breakage on some governments, unfortunately, pretty high.
Great thoughts. Now, there's a couple questions here about the stock market and how it may not be totally the best reflection of the economic reality of the country right now, given that we're testing new all-time highs and we've got really high unemployment. So what are some of the other indicators that you look at in terms of economic health besides the stock market, whether it's unemployment, housing, or other things like that?
So an important message here, Jeff, is many of the people that I've talked to that are wicked smart believe the stock market is wrong in terms of the economic direction of the future of the country 12, 24 months out. The stock market eventually always gets it right, sometimes up and down and getting there. So when the stock market is indicating something, I would be very quickly to naively say it's just wrong. And there are a lot of people that believe it's wrong currently. I made that mistake in 2000. 70% growth, stock market was down 20%. Stock market was probably wrong, wasn't it? It was not. So I do think over time, it's a good indication of the future. The stock market, when I was worried about the market, was when I saw things slow down in Asia with my startups in February and March. And I was a pessimist to them. Today, I'm in the stock market, not just with my venture capital companies, but also in the stock market in a long position. And I think more likely than not, my own view with all the appropriate disclaimers is the market over the next couple months will go up. Then it becomes down to how well do we execute as a country? and how well do we handle the pandemic when it comes back in the fall? Do we have drugs that dramatically improve the likelihood of the mortality rates dropping dramatically, or better yet, even a vaccine? Do we do the social discipline right, et cetera, on it? Now, in terms of the market, if you have hesitation, and I do have hesitation overall because the stewardess say for sure this direction, I'm just very cautious on my spending, very careful about not growing headcount too quickly, doing more with less, which at first puts strain on the organization, but then it allows you to stop doing the things that really didn't add as much value on it. So I'm a huge believer, prepare for the tough times and hope for the best and then execute through them. But right now, my view is the next 12 to 24 months, the odds are much more likely that it will be a better shape 12 months from now and beyond than in worse shape. That's what the market reflects.
Now, John, you've been a big fan of, a big promoter of mentorship throughout your career.
Yes.
Question here from the audience. How have mentors helped you during times of crisis, and how should entrepreneurs go about seeking that type of help differently this time around?
Well, I think mentorship is something that I've always done crowdsourcing, and I always learn to learn from others. And I would ask anyone, it doesn't matter if it's a person who's the doorman at a hotel about what's traffic like and what are the tips like to get an idea of the local economy, or a Thomas Friedman, a great writer out of the New York Times on his philosophy about certain issues, a President Clinton or President Bush, both of whom I was very close to in terms of what they saw going on economically, Shimon Peres in Israel, one of the top leaders ever, who passed away about 2 years ago, and a great friend. I miss him every day. Or leaders like a Jack Welch or Sandy Well or others who led forward. I would always learn from them. And I would ask people, not would they mentor me, but could I have one meeting with them? And let's use Lou Platt at HP as an example, Hewlett Packard. And when I came here with Cisco, people didn't even know who we were. People got us confused with the food trucks that were called Cisco. I called up Lou and I said, Lou, you at HP have a tremendous culture. And candidly, I'm running a 400-person company with something called the internet that people don't even know what it is. I don't know the Valley. I know what I know and know what I don't. I may not admit to it, but I knew I did not know Silicon Valley in its way. I said, can I come and meet with you? And he said, sure, and shocked me. I met with him at the end of the session. Can I come back? So next quarter I came back. Next quarter, can I come back again? By the fourth quarter, he said, I got it, John. You want me to mentor? I said, yes, sir. And he said, you can bring some of your team and do that as well. 3.5 years later, we were on fire as a company in a very positive way. I turned to Lou and I said, Lou, what can I do now for you and for HP? Because you've helped me so much. His answer stuck with me and determined in part how I relate to Silicon Valley today in a very strong way. He said, John, just do it for the next generation. So I've tried to always do that. I'm far from perfect. A lot of challenges, as my wife would be the first one to admit, in terms of areas I need to do better. But I'm a huge believer in mentoring and coaching. And I only do that with a subset of companies. I do it with the 18 that I've invested in. I probably do it with another 30 loosely. And then sessions like today with an audience where I can share mistakes and lesson learned as you go forward. But mentoring is a huge part. There are two ways to learn, from your own mistakes or from others. And I'd rather learn from others.
Fantastic. And John, a little bit more of a practical question here
Sure.
from one of the audience. If you don't yet have 24 months of cash in the bank, is it better to take equity funding on maybe less favorable terms? Or is it time to start looking at lines of credit and debt financing as an alternative?
So you've asked one of the most complex questions imaginable, and it depends on more facts than just the two you stated for it. And remember, if you agree with everything, Jeff, that I've said to your audience today, if they agree, I've failed. I want to get people uncomfortable. So the first issue is you got to survive. Second issue is if you can raise the terms internally by having more dilution, I would say raise the money within that. Your most likely sources of new capital, every VC says they're open, most of them are not. Most of the VCs will invest largely in their own portfolio, and they're just trying to get those through these changes until they see a clearer path going forward. So your most likely source of funds are either VCs that already have invested in you, or ones where you have key contacts that they know you and you've developed those currencies, if you will, the relationships, the track record, the trust that goes with it. The debt funding, I'm not a big believer in terms of long-term capital. It's a way you get through some of the bumps. It's a way you put a safety net in place, but you want to be very, very careful that the companies who really overextend themselves, and then if the crisis lasts longer than expected, or if a second wave comes and gets knocked down, that's how they get eliminated. So I'd be careful about the borrowing. You want to do it in a terms that you can manage with a high probability. You should do scenario A, B, and C planning. If you're going to go to a great bank like Silicon Valley Bank, which has 60% of the startups in the US as customers, if you go to them and the first question one of the loan officers asks you is, all right, tell me what your most likely plan is for this year. And you say, it's the same one I started out the year with, you probably aren't going to get the loan. And then you say, I've adjusted my plan for this year. I have a scenario B, which is down about 25% versus what was there before. That's what our current run rate is. They say, interesting. Tell me about your scenario C planning. What happens if it gets worse? And if you don't have a good answer, you're probably not going to get the loan again. And so what I'm sharing with you is you want to be careful how you raise money. You want to be practical on it. And if you can, you want to use the cash that you have for as long as you can, then get equity funding early now. And I'm having most all my companies try to move to 24 months free cash flow under the current, cash flow covered under the current run rates in terms of the options for it. And if you have to take out some debt to help get that safety net there so you can navigate through it, then I would do that, but I'd do it as a third priority.
Great. Now, John, one of your super talents is seeing around corners. Can you help us see around this corner? And what's your short and longer term perspective for recovery?
Well, nobody knows to those answers, but I have a lot of limitations, but I'm pretty good about pattern recognition and connecting the dots. It's what allowed us to see the 1997 Asian financial crisis, respond to the 2001 dot-com bubble, to see the recession coming in 2008, et cetera, on it. And so I put at the very forefront my customers. They are the single position of truth, what's really going on. And I ask them all the time in a very calm way, what are you seeing in your business? How valuable am I to you achieving your goals? What am I doing right? What do we need to improve on? By the time I see several things from customers and key people I respect, then it's a trend. So when you saw the downturn, the Asian financial crisis, it was a trend once that it got identified several times. In 2007, we didn't talk about it, but 8 of my financial institutions in the US slowed their ordering rate down just a little bit. The numbers were good in total, but 8 at one time, I don't think so. The seeing around corners was 8 at one time, we got a problem coming. We set our company up for that problem, navigated through it very strong, and took risk in it. So I listened. When we saw the challenges develop in January, February in Asia, and all of a sudden my Asian startups like Unifor were suddenly saying, our orders are looking like there's hesitancy. We're having more trouble getting things closed. We're having trouble getting key customer meetings set up. I may have to go close this deal personally in Vietnam or in Malaysia that I wouldn't have had to do before. I'd seen that movie before, and that meant there was a problem coming. And today, activity levels are up across most of my startups. Not like we want like this, but gradually up the last 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, stock market's up. So it's watching those trends. I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm a realistic optimist. So when I said 3 to 5 quarters would be my best cut of this downturn, everybody initially said in February, March, I'm wrong and too pessimistic. I still think that's most likely. Now, some people might say I'm too optimistic. I don't think so. I think if we navigate through it and execute well and get a little bit lucky, but with good execution on how to deal with the pandemic, I think we look out 15, 12, 24 months from now, and we're back getting unemployment back under control. Remember, the stock market's an indication of the future, and getting the job creation engine running again. But again, repeating the same theme, next 2 quarters are going to be really tough.
Great. Well, appreciate that perspective, John, and we are almost out of time. So is there one final takeaway you'd like to leave the entrepreneurs with who have joined us here today to impart in your wisdom?
Well, one in a fun way, part of the wisdom is you want to have great partners in life. And I just want to thank Nasdaq again for being a tremendous partner with me all the way forward. I'd encourage the entrepreneurs to take a close look at your all's organization if they're thinking about going public. But what I'd like to challenge the group with is, I think we've lost a little bit our ability to dream and make dreams come true. I think because in the last 12 years, no one's seen a major slowdown, and many of the leaders, especially small companies, weren't anywhere near close to leadership positions 12 years ago. Our confidence gets shook. And where I would look at today is dream what's possible, do it financially very conservative, and take the risks now to go forward. I think you are the future of this nation. I think you're the future of all job creation. And I think you're the economic engine for our innovation and the future of our country. So have the courage to dream, as Shimon Peres taught me. Dream like a teenager. Remember when you thought anything was possible, whether you could be a professional sports player. I love basketball, as you can tell from the basketballs behind me. Other than not being big enough, fast enough, and quite a good enough shot, that was the only problem. The ability to dream what you can do together with your company. And last thought, focus on the economic benefit and the benefits to society together. I think that's just the right way to run it in the future. Jeff, I hope this was worthwhile for your viewers. And again, I hope people disagree with us on some of the issues raised. I want you outside your comfort zone.
John and Jeff, thank you both so much. Words of inspiration. Here's to dreaming the impossible through the lens of looking at societal benefit and economic prosperity for all of us. Really, truly inspiring. So appreciated today. We have put a feedback link in our chat box. Our ask of all of you today is to take just a moment or two to let us know what sat with you, what resonated, what more you would like to hear, not just from our amazing talent that joined us today, but also as we go forward through this times that we're all in together. We will be making sure that you have access to this webinar link after the fact, so you can ingest and review it afterwards too. And finally, we are going to be launching that second poll that didn't launch earlier on. So we're going to be kicking that up on screen right now, again, just to get a sense as to whether or not you are one of our current entrepreneurs in market, whether or not you aspire to be one of our entrepreneurs soon to be in market, or if you're joining us as an ecosystem supporter at large. Again, it has been an absolute pleasure. Our thanks to all our sponsors who make this work possible, who believe in the dreamers day in and day out. We look forward to welcoming you to our next session soon. Our next webinar coming up is Managing Financial Anxiety with BPM, and that will be hosted on Thursday. We're going to actually have some very practical and tactical information on how we can actually start growing towards that 24 months of cash flow basis. So join us on Thursday if you're looking for that kind of support. Again, a pleasure seeing everyone here today. Take care and dream big.